NordVPN is becoming more than just a VPN. Threat protection will guard your device against malicious websites, malware, trackers, and intrusive ads, even if you're not connected to a VPN server at the time. Step up your cybersecurity and stay safe.
I invested £25,000. Today, that investment is worth £5 million.
Say hello to our hero, the Hydrogen Energy Release Optimizer. Limitless power, zero emissions.
Hey everybody, I am joined by Tom Luongo, Alexander Macoris or Alex Trainer, who are unable to join us. But never mind, me and Tom, we are going to, Tom is going to share his expertise and wisdom and his analysis on all the stuff that's going on in the world. Please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, CryptoRichYT, join my official Telegram announcements channel, and bit.ly/CryptoRich3speak and bit.ly/CryptoRichOdyssee. Not all of this video will be on YouTube as an effort to encourage people to come on over to these censorship-resistant platforms. All right, Tom, we haven't even created what we're going to talk about, because we do a little bit.
Nope.
Let's just start. I mean,
there's nothing to talk about, Rich. Why don't we just end the show?
There's nothing going on. Do you know, actually, Tom, I'm
like an old Monty Python skit and roll credits, right? No, the show starts immediately.
Well, let's start this way, right? And we can go on to some of the other stuff that's more topical straight away. We don't have to stick with this. I'm actually upset. I listened to an analysis of the King's speech. Mm-hmm. The friend of the late great Jimmy Savile, the King's speech, what the legislation is planned for us by these fake WF Tories. One of the things they're going to do is they're going to legislate to give police the right of access to people's homes without a warrant.
Yeah,
I'm like, what the hell has happened?
To your country?
Well, the WEF has happened, right? But I'm like, geez, I want to go to a local Conservative Party meeting and say to them, look, can we have some traditional Conservative values, please?
No, because when you push either side hard enough, you uncover a fascist every time. Same thing happens here in the United States. The minute some innocent gets killed, the Democrats want to take all our guns, and the minute somebody unsavory kills, does the wrong thing with corruption, then the Republicans want to, expand police power. So it's the same argument over and over and over again, and it is ultimately just the same silly march towards. Again, I keep making. I know I offend everybody when I say this because they don't like it when I'm this reductionist, but it's just the slow walk towards communism. And yes, communism, you can easily just turn around and go, well, that's a dodge for, a cover story for, neo-feudalism or some other ism that, better, quote unquote, fits the bill. But let's just stick with, basic understanding here. As Alexander Macoris would point out if he were here, because he pointed it out to me originally, that at the end of the day, communist states are the ultimate technocratic states. The greatest technocratic state in the history of the world up to the end of the 20th century was the USSR. Mm-hmm. Is anybody really surprised that the current march towards the ultimate version of that technocratic state is the EU SSR? Like it's the same ideology. Whatever their justification is irrelevant. What they want ultimately in the end is 100% tax compliance, 100% surveillance, and no individual right to sovereignty. This is what they believe in. This is what and so I know you can dress it up with whatever fucking ism you want. It don't matter. It's the same thing. So let's stop disagreeing on terms. I like to use communism because it's like the catch-all pejorative for bad people. And let's just move forward.
No, absolutely.
And stop talking about isms and start talking about what we need to do to stop these people.
Which is liberty versus authoritarianism. And it is, and I'm getting more and more, right? Remember the first time I ever spoke to you and we started talking about money and big government and liberty and stuff. And it's the nature of government to take on more power for itself.
Right. It was interesting the other day, Rich. We were chatting on my Slack server, my private server for my patrons, and somebody brought up, and we were talking about the fact that now the Russian, like that in general, that Russians are becoming more trusted partners than the Europeans are. I'm like, isn't that interesting? That just being half facetious, right? I said, being snarky. I said, oh, isn't that funny that we have Russian mobsters are more trustworthy than cultured European elites, right? And somebody, and one of my patrons, savvy guy, always comes back and says, well, the one thing about the mob is that they make demand they're big, but they're very predictable in how they go about their business, which, by the way, describes Russians and the Russian government and Russian oligarchs very well. If you don't cross them, if you treat them honestly, even though they are fundamentally, you can argue whether or not they're crooks or criminals or gangsters or whatever. But the same thing happens here in the United States. Organized crime has a set of rules. They live by a certain code. Scorsese's gangster movies go over this over and over and over again. And they become not the heroes of the pieces. Well, they may or may not be the heroes of the pieces, but and invariably, who are they fighting? They're running into government, because government needs to take out the predictability of the mob, which actually creates a form of civilized culture. Okay? It may not be perfect, but it is a form of civilization. You can even argue that it's a better form of civilization than any, and certainly you can make the argument, I think Scorsese does very well, makes the argument that it's a better form of civilization than the one that government creates. And, Scorsese, the old libertarian, that's kind of why his movies were always so unbelievably engaging, because it was so outside of our frame of reference within this Marxist thinking that we have to get rid of the mob in order to replace it with government because government is righteous. Well, no. Government takes the predictability and stability of the mob and replaces it with maximum levels of instability and unpredictability, because it's not designed to do that. It can't do that. It actually wants to create uncertainty and strife, and in order to hoover up all the money for itself, because that's what it does. Even if it can only do that because it's an organization that has no ethos. Okay? Government doesn't have an ethos. Government doesn't have any self-correcting mechanism. If any country on the planet has proven that government can't be constrained by, separation of powers and interlocking this and blah, it's the United States. We keep calling it the grand experiment in governance, and guess what? Maybe it would work if we lived in a world where everybody else practiced the same thing, but we don't. And therefore, those lofty ideals, while somewhat successful for a long, long period of time, have proven to not be strong enough to contain the chaos created by all the fucking crazies out there, the old authoritarians, the old money, and everything else. Because nothing exists in a vacuum. We didn't create the United States out of whole cloth in a vacuum and then let it run. We created it in the context of the breakdown of old colonial Europe. Okay? And the immense amount of wealth that they had at their disposal to undermine the evolution of the United States and to affect the evolution of the United States. And so, again, not trying to put the United States up on some kind of shining house on the hill bullshit, because I don't buy that either. Just saying that, looking at it as a clash of governance types, as Alex Craner would point out if he were here. This is the situation. And so, it was a very simple conversation, maybe 4 or 5 little back and forth between 3 or 4 people in the short thread on the server, but it was so profound when I was reminded, I'm like, oh yeah, I go right back to like first principles, what I learned from Murray Rothbard. The government is just a gang of thieves writ large. They're just the mob, except they're not even as good as the mob, because at least the mob had a code.
Yeah, no, they absolutely, they really are gangsters. And talking of the US being born out of the collapse of the old European colonialists, we have the collapse of the EU colonialists, the slow rolling collapse. I saw your tweet where you had the indexes for the different stock markets, and the ones in the US, green, and the FTSE and the DAX and the other ones, right?
French CAC 40 and the Italian markets, yeah.
That's right.
All red.
And Tom, you asked the question, what does this show you? Something like that. And I thought, I worked it out. Money is fleeing. It's fleeing. The euro-dollar market is fleeing, and it's going into the US.
One of the things it's funny, Rich, and I rarely ever ask questions like that, right? I'm just usually blunt. Oh, by the way, but on Twitter, I'm like, I know what this means to me. What does it mean to you? And then there's no way in Twitter for me to go back and go, look at the replies, folks. I've actually taught everybody what's going on. The overwhelming response to that tweet, which was very edifying, which was, oh, look, everyone gets it. And a few people didn't get it, and I responded only to the people who didn't get it. Yeah. Right? To try and explain it one more time. Like, nope, check your premises. Nope, no. And again, to try and grease the wheels of the conversation, try and get people to think differently about these things. And that brings up a really interesting point. And it was one I made for my patrons last week on last Sunday's market report, which was I put up one of the slides I always do. One of the markets I always cover is the Dow. And so I got done putting the charts together. I'm like, I noted something between the U.S. and German markets because we had this huge bond rally, right, after the Federal Reserve, where everybody was like, oh, Powell's pivoting and he's going to go back to the zero bound, and everybody went nuts. And there was this 40 to 50 basis point move in the U.S. yield, all across the U.S. yield curve, meaning people bought U.S. Treasuries like they were going out of style. And they moved the yield on U.S. Treasuries down by 40 basis points, which means that they bid the price up by X amount, right? What I noted, of course, because I check other things on a regular basis, is that the German market only moved down 24 basis points, which tells you that everybody was a buyer of sovereign debt because everybody believed all of a sudden that the Fed was going to loosen monetary policy, and therefore they were betting on the Fed cutting interest rates. But preferentially speaking, people bought U.S. debt preferentially over German debt, which is why the spread collapsed by 16 basis points. Right? U.S. market moves down 40 basis points, or up 7%, for example, but the German market only moved up 5%. Okay, well, guess what? We saw the same exact thing in the equity markets. The Dow and the NASDAQ were up 5%, and the European markets were up 3%. Same thing. Everybody was on. And when bonds and equities are up at the same time on a moment like that, and this tells you a couple of things. One, in general, the markets were cheap. Right? U.S. bonds have gotten too cheap. U.S. equities have gotten too cheap. European equities have gotten too cheap. Japanese equities have gotten too cheap. And that after a sincere sell-off, the bears were overcommitted. And so they had to do some short covering. They had to cover their short positions and buy. And then, so you get a mixture of a sentiment shift plus short covering gives you a rip your face off rally in bonds and equities. This happens, and it's a short, sharp correction within a primary bear market, right? Or in the case of the equity markets, a consolidating market that's just kind of the equity markets for the most part are trading sideways. They're going up a certain amount, they get too expensive, then you sell the rally, and then you buy the dip, and you stay within a certain range. The Dow, for example, has been in a range between, say, 33,000 on the low end, or 32.5 on the low end, and 35.5 on the high end for almost a year now, right? Whereas there's a definite bear market in sovereign debt. And so all we saw was a bull market correction in sovereign debt, which is interesting about this. And the final point, and then I'll turn the microphone back over, which is this, because it just hit. And it hit me the other day and we're thinking about this, which is that, again, another conversation we had on our private discussion server. And there was this 30-year auction from the U.S. that everybody commented on. Oh my God, the U.S. is the worst U.S. Treasury auction like ever.
All right, if you want to follow the rest of this conversation, then please come to my Odyssey channel. And this is because of the censorship on YouTube. You can go to Crypto Rich Odyssey, or you can find a link to the second part of this video in the description below.